A common question I get asked off the back of the Datalink short and other content I've made in the past is how to defend against it. So I figured I'd put together a little video with some breakdowns of how this plays out when someone fires from above with a Fox-3. Now this first clip is what can happen if you do nothing other than notch in a straight line. The Datalink keeps the inertial guidance updated and the missile is not interested in any of my chaff. In the end, it starts falling behind me, which essentially moves me out of the notch, it reconnects and takes me out. Whilst I run through this same shot in sensor view, it's worth noting this isn't incredibly likely to happen, especially with the Eurofighter for example, which can carry a lot of speed. You'll often find the missile simply runs out of energy chasing you. We actually redid this first shot multiple times with me intentionally flying slower because I just kept outrunning the missiles. So pure Datalink shots are unlikely to score a hit, especially on fast moving targets. The power of Datalink is keeping the inertial guidance from drifting and it stays centered on your target. You keep them defensive for longer because if they recommit, the missile is well placed to reconnect. You can also use multipath of course, but as always depending on the aspect that can be a gamble and maybe you're fighting at higher relative altitudes anyway. So for the purposes of these demos I won't include multipath, but it is an option to consider along with simply breaking line of sight with terrain if possible. So the first method of defense of course is just don't get into a situation where your opponent can hold a top-down lock on you. If you can return fire, you of course always should. For the next shot, shortly after Carlos launches, I return fire. Now when I get to my notch, he's holding the Datalink for a time at the start, but eventually he has to break it in order to defend my own launch. Now I'm not pitching up a huge amount here, but the inertial guidance of his missile is now slowly drifting away based on my last known trajectory, rather than receiving the Datalink updates from his radar. As a side note, this is why radars with larger gimbal limits like say the J10's 85-degree radar are strong for Datalink, as you can more reliably hold your locks whilst notching incoming missiles. Once again we look at the shot in sensor view. Now you can see the missile state, how it switches from IOG plus DL to pure IOG, meaning it starts drifting away as I pitch up slightly. Of course I should be changing altitude more aggressive here to clear the IOG, but I'll get to that a bit later. For now I just want to focus on the fact that by returning fire you force your opponent to break their lock. The next one is a bit more complicated and a little bit trickier depending on how big the offset between the launching platform and the missile's radar is. In these stage 1v1 demos, the offset is very small, so this tactic is quite reliable. My objective here is to move around on the horizontal axis to move the launching platform's radar into a notch. Of course the missile may reconnect as I'm potentially moving out of the missile's notch angle, but first I'm trying to break Carlos's own lock because re-establishing Datalink doesn't really work in War Thunder. I move to notch his radar, then move back to notch the missile if it reconnected in that time. I'll show you a couple of these in sensor view so you can get a sense of what I mean. You'll notice actually that when I notch his radar, it switches to the chaff and the Datalink actually takes the missile off course, tracking the chaff through that Datalink in this one. In the second example, the same thing happens again. We see the missile briefly Datalinked onto the chaff again before switching fully to IOG once Carlos loses his lock completely. Carlos actually manages to successfully relock me, but you can see the missile remains in IOG. It's no longer receiving help from the Datalink and is floating harmlessly behind me. The missile does switch back to track briefly at the end, but it doesn't have the energy to catch up to me, and you can see that all it's tracking there is the chaff behind my plane. Finally, we have altitude variation. This is generally a good thing to do in all notching scenarios, as I've mentioned in previous videos. In this situation, I'm imagining that for whatever reason I could not return fire and I don't feel like I have the time to break the Datalink first. In these cases, if you just commit to notching the missile, yes, the Datalink will keep it on course, but by making these aggressive trajectory changes, you'll be bleeding it of energy. Also, if you pitch up a lot like I am here, you may be able to force it back into track as a result of it not being top down anymore. This means that my chaff is now effective again, and sometimes it may bite on said chaff. Pure Datalink missiles will of course not, as I've shown. In this example it angle gates me though, so it does stay on IOG and stay on course, but all of the aggressive maneuvering has allowed me to outpace the missile anyway. Just be wary of planes with less power than this. Remember, you may need to pitch into the missile as it starts to fall behind you like it did in this last example to maintain your notch. But you will find that if you're making sure you maintain the notch on the missile, changing your altitude, just being a general difficult target to hit, a pure Datalink hit is extremely unlikely to get you. I do have one more bonus tip for you. So being below the missile and allowing datalink to be a factor can be a disadvantage, of course. However, it can also be a benefit if you know they won't be able to hold the lock anyway, because getting below the missile essentially forces it into IOG. I was practicing some jousts with Supreme here, and I got a bug that sometimes pops up in customs, making me unable to pop any chaff. It's at roughly this point I realised my chaff isn't working, so I'm on my own. First I pull an aggressive vertical dive, turning back on myself in the notch. This first manoeuvre is designed to defeat the first launch on energy. I'm also getting lower, ready for the second launch. You see how I'm below the missile now? After letting it lead me, I start to neg G so I can make sure I maintain the notch whilst pitching down. I am going to pause it here though. So I can give you all the tech and tips you like, but there's always going to be an element of feel, awareness and experience doing things like this. I know the missile should switch to IOG here, however looking at the diamond, its trajectory still appears to be on an intercept. This isn't always easy to see compared to when it is on IOG, which is why I say there's an element of feel and experience with this. There is a slight clue on my RWR though. The missile indicator is slightly ahead of the 90 degrees and I'm looking out for things like this while I'm doing it. You will notice once I play the sensor view afterwards though, it was in fact still in IOG, and despite not quite being at 90 degrees, I was sufficiently in the notch for the missile's radar. Supreme did give it some data link at the start to keep it on target is what actually happened here. The second clue being I still have his airframe's radar faintly on my RWR. However, as I've also fired, he will be forced to break this lock in order to defend, so I do two things after I play this through again. I pull a bit further away from the missile just to ensure I'm definitely in the notch, and I also continue to neg G to get out of the missile's trajectory. Meanwhile, Supreme is going to eat my missile and I win that joust without popping a single bit of chaff. That's all for today. I'll put that one up in sensor view for the outro just so you can see I'm not making anything up. Watch for the way I defeat the first launch with energy and the switch to IOG on the second. Only a short video, I just wanted to make this little datalink defense tutorial for people to reference to. Hopefully it was helpful and I'll see you again next time.